Humans don't realize the extent to which we rely on narratives in order to function as human beings, and I mean this in three important ways. Firstly, our egos are always engaged in a process of narratizing everything we do, and in this narrative we act as the lead characters, playing out our lives in a linear fashion. What we're doing in the present depends on what we have been doing in the past, and maintaining a kind of continuity between past, present, and future. In fact, if we didn't have this ability, it would be hard to do anything at all, because every moment would just seem isolated and disconnected from the prior moment. To a certain extent, this is how animals experience reality, especially if they're more primitive. Just think about how you play your respective role and what you believe your role in this world is. And that's the thing, we're each narratizing the role we think we play. This is very often tied to our work identity, i.e. who we think we are professionally. I'm a locksmith, a lapidarist, an arborist, but also who we are in a more spiritual sense, like with respect to what you value and what you believe in. Whatever we actually do can only come about if we imagine ourselves participating in a kind of story which we tell ourselves. And this story has characters, you as the main character, but also the people you regularly interact with. In your mind, other people appear as the characters in your story. And it's almost like you build a profile for these characters, but these exist entirely within your own mind, perhaps influenced by your interactions with said people, but nevertheless they exist in your mind. The second way in which narratives are important for human functioning is that we engage in collective fictions, and unbeknownst to many people, these collective fictions are fundamental structural elements of society. These collective mental machinations allow us to agree upon the world in which we share. Take language, for example. Language is a way for our minds to recreate a virtual, perhaps somewhat fictionalized version of the world we experience. But it's also a way for us to live in this world collectively, because giving certain objects words allows people to communicate and actually know what the other person is saying. Language functions because we generally agree on the meaning of words. Obviously, this system doesn't function perfectly, and there can be ambiguity in what we say, but it's still only possible because of shared fictions. But shared fictions also form the basis of society. Things like governments only exist insofar as we all collectively participate in a thing called a government. Borders on countries are a good example, since they are fundamentally cognitive constructions. We decide where those borders are, like it's not like the earth knows where we draw the borders. And when we can't decide where borders are, just as an example, it means that some people believe in one fiction and other people believe in another fiction, but they're both fundamentally fictitious and decided by our minds. Thirdly, and this is I guess the main subject of this video, we are constantly saturated by fictions in a more colloquial sense. AKA, we consume fictional stories about people and events who don't exist or who have been fictionalized, like the Buddha or Socrates, for example. I'm speaking of mythology, fairy tales, novels, series, movies, video games as well. The human race as a whole spends a great deal of time preoccupied by these fictional stories. And just think about how riveting a really good story can be. I just recently was reading the sci-fi series that has completely blown me away. It's called The Three-Body Problem, and it's profound on so many levels. It raises so many philosophical questions about the universe and how frightening space can be. But it's also just so imaginative. It produced this sense in me that the human species has advanced so rapidly, and yet we haven't even tapped into the technological potential of some of the discoveries we've made in physics. And it also just amazed me that such an idea came from someone's mind. Really great stories are a window into genius, which is why we consider many great stories to be masterpieces. Think of a movie or a book or a video game with a really good story and just think about how it impacted you. And share in the comments even if you have a story that's been really impactful for you, because I'd love to know what kind of stories have been influential in your lives. And this is actually what a considerable number of us do in our free time. Also in time that we should be spending doing other things, because basically everyone I know has at one time or another been so riveted by a show that they binge watch the entire thing in a day. In fact, the earliest stories that mankind has written tell us a lot about the cognitive evolution of our species. And the fact that we still make an effort to preserve these stories demonstrates the reverence we hold for them. But the question is, what is this reverence based on? It has to do with the fact that stories often communicate ideas in a way that is all-encapsulating and truly gripping. A story seems to have a much greater information content than the words used to communicate it. In other words, it's more than the sum of its parts, and the message being transmitted activates the whole of our being so that the message is received by our unconscious minds. The best stories require no conscious input in order to be impactful, although we can often use our conscious mind to analyze stories and pick them apart so that the conscious mind can also participate in the understanding of the story. I was trying to think of ways to demonstrate this, and I thought it would be a good idea to consider some myths. For example, Plato's allegory of the chariot. I'll put a full description of the myth in the comments for you to digest as you watch this video. Plato used this narrative to demonstrate how he understood the nature of the human soul. And the story functions as a symbol, something that doesn't have a literal meaning, but rather the unconscious psyche immediately recognizes something familiar, something symbolic being used to circumscribe something internal in which we all experience. And in fact, that sense of familiarity is one of the things which the psyche seeks. It seeks symbols which are self-descriptive, and this allows the conscious mind to make sense of the unconscious, but also of deeper realizations. Therefore, myths allow our minds to transcend themselves, so to speak, not merely to be bound within what biology designed us to do, but to go beyond. Now here's a very important question I want everyone to contemplate. Is the story true? Or a better question, is this an accurate depiction of the human soul? Insofar as it describes the human soul, it does so by analogy, so is it true? The story functions as a metaphor, and the metaphor helps reveal something which we all experience. And in fact, all knowledge is like this. It is using metaphors as a way to illustrate something. So even cognitive schemas which seem to be true are still just kind of fictions that we impose upon reality in order to make sense of it. A cognitive scheme is what we use to understand something, but in our scientific and rational age, we've made the bizarre assumption that we can say that certain cognitive schemes are true and objective while others are false and imaginary. And so the allegory of the chariot may fall into the false and imaginary category, but in reality, it's being used to illuminate something which is very familiar to every one of us. And so the difference between real and fictional is actually not super clear cut for reasons I've described here. What I would argue is that myth is able to illuminate deep truths about the way things are, but it does so in a way that is much more vivid, alive, and richer than merely attempting an explanation solely with our language and trying to be as literal as possible. Myths open the way for philosophical ponderings, and again, the narrative format is a much better mode of transmission for philosophical ideas because placing things in a narrative allows the essential philosophical questions to unfold in a contextual structure. So, for example, take a story like 1984, and the philosophical ramifications that are implied by the situations with which the characters must face. It isn't like someone telling you why authoritarianism is so soul-crushing, rather the story explains itself. This doesn't mean that stories are unambiguous in their meanings and not open to multiple interpretations. In fact, quite the opposite. The multiplicity of meanings that can be derived from a well-crafted story also speaks to why symbols are so powerful, and why their information content is so high. In my opinion, anything which is able to go beyond its mere parts is an example of emergence, because the myth as a whole is able to convey something which isn't necessarily present in the parts. The effect of stories upon our psyches explain why religions are very often characterized by collections of stories, and these stories become revered for their revelatory character. Most holy books are really just collections of myths. They're allegories that usually present a particular moral problem, or attempt to illustrate the nature of the world, again not doing so in a literal way, but by doing so through narrative. Even if the elements of these stories are fictional, they represent things which are true. Even though again, the word true here is really hard to pin down in the context of this discussion. If you think back to a time when mankind was more primitive, the revelatory nature of these stories, their ability to tread familiar paths which play out in the life of every individual, explains why we held these stories as being nearly divine. We recognized in myths something which existed within us, but also within the world at large. And that's what I mean when I say that myths are revelatory. It's obvious today that we've lost this sacred connection with myths, partially because of our rationalistic worldview, and partially also because we're so saturated by stories and they've become heavily commercialized, and hence there is less emphasis upon the sacred quality of myths. But partaking in myths used to be a collective experience. I mean, I guess it still is when you go to like a movie theater, but the relevance of a myth for our individual lives also mean that myths grant us a sense of connection between all people, since archetypes exist in the collective unconscious of all individuals. So just think to a time when people would have these religious gatherings where myths were recited, and hence everyone could collectively experience that sense of revelation which the myth provides. And it's important to remember as well, from a psychological perspective, that the unconscious mind is a kind of myth maker. Your dreams are symbolic stories that function in a similar manner to myths, as they try to encapsulate big ideas and present them in a package which is richer and deeper and more engaging. One can argue that myth is the language of the unconscious. Insofar as the unconscious speaks to us, it speaks to us through myths. This is why myths can also give us an understanding of the archetypal structure of the psyche, and that sense of familiarity for an archetype is our unconscious recognizing something which exists within itself, but it has been given a more concrete manifestation in the form of a symbol. The symbol wraps itself around the archetype to give it structure and form. Now, a part of all of this that I haven't mentioned yet is how mythological figures and characters in stories actually play a very vital role in the formation of the psyche and of the ego. Great characters are usually a vehicle for transmitting a higher spiritual aspect of the psyche. The actions of characters themselves raise philosophical questions, but they also demonstrate how humanity can transcend to the spiritual heights. To demonstrate this, here's a Buddhist myth. A famous story tells how, in a previous life, the Buddha took pity on a starving tigress, who might otherwise have had to eat her newborn cubs. He sacrificed himself instead, so that the tiger cubs could have something to eat. Think about a person sacrificing their lives in this way. We see something reverential in a story like this because we see someone being more than human, transcending their own desire for survival while also demonstrating a superhuman level of kindness and empathy. Many mythological characters are superhumans, people who are godlike, either in their capacities or in their actions. So not only are we gaining an understanding of things through myths, we are also presented with models for behavior, for metaphysical ideals which show us the kind of person we should strive to be. Rationality doesn't tell us what we should do and how we should act, but myths actually do. This is why Christianity, as an example, encourages us to be like Jesus. Be like him even though it's immensely difficult. And I'm speaking of Jesus as a mythological figure because that's exactly how the story of Jesus is presented to us. The historical facts concerning Jesus' life are one thing, but the mythological story that we've received has a completely different function. It shows us a person transcending their humanity, and it gives us a template of what we ought to act like. And of course, different myths present different ideals that we're supposed to strive for, but that nevertheless is their function. The extent to which this is true is kind of hard to overstate. You watching this video were probably shaped by mythological characters, i.e. people who didn't exist. Your psyche likely contains the traces of a fictional person doing fictional things who you emulated. Through their behavior as characters, as fictional characters, you were shown an example of what you could strive for as a human. And so you likely even imitated such characters, and you might even be imitating them now unconsciously. Now, remember how I said that the ego is itself a kind of fictional character? Well, it's also true that this fictional character may have been inspired by other fictional characters. I can say that many fictional characters have shaped my psyche in a lot of ways, and I call these metaphysical ideals because they are characters that show us what we could be, what we ought to strive for. So myths are centrally important with respect to what it means to be a human. But it's easy to lose sight of that fact in a world that's so obsessed with literal truth, even though all truth comes about through metaphors, analogies, symbols, and models. So we can't ever actually penetrate into the truth about anything. And I think this is lost on a lot of people today because, to be fair, it actually isn't that obvious. But hopefully you understand why myths should be revered and why reverence for myth is essential for human existence. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to support me, a great way to do so would be to sign up on Patreon, and that way you'll get access to the Discord server, and you'll be able to partake in discussions that we have there, and you'll be able to support the creation of better videos. So if you're able to do that, that would be super awesome. Anyways, have a good day, and may good luck always come your way.